So today I'm going to talk about magic systems and their design and high level magic systems or their design and how those design choices, how those very high level design choices affect your magic system. So, we're going to talk about high magic versus low magic. We're going to talk about hidden magic, as in only the people who use magic know about the magic, versus open magic. It's known across the world and everybody understands that magic exists. We're also going to talk about hard magic versus soft magic and what that actually means both for your design and for your reader or well, if you're designing for a role playing or video game, you're definitely designing a hard magic system. And then lastly, we're going to talk about genetic versus non-genetic magic. And this will be a conversation around when do you use genetic magic systems and what advantages do non-genetic offer you over genetic and what are the implications of both. Okay, let's talk about high magic versus low magic. High magic is basically when there's a lot of magic, when it's a spectacle magic system. In essence, high magic systems are systems when high magic systems are systems that essentially have magic being the center point of what is going on in the fantastical. So this is your Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time. It is allomancy from Brandon Sanderson. There's magic that has got a great deal of effect. This is contrary with low magic. Low magic is essentially when you have much less magic, that magic is of a softer nature and it's much less reliable. Okay, so examples of low magic systems are George R.R. Martin, Joe Abercrombie, those kinds of worlds, your typical low magic. Okay, so in terms of high magic, your big advantages of this one is that it is a spectacle and it is something that epic fantasy readers do enjoy. In fact, most fantasy system readers do enjoy high magic. Yes, of course, there are many who like low magic as well, but low magic does come with less of that fantastical element. So you have to work harder in your world building to include that fantastical element. High magic also gives you a lot of versatility. So you can use magic as a tool to problem solve. And of course, it does give you that escapism for your readers. However, it does also run the risk of devaluation. That is to say, overuse of magic can lessen the impact of magic, making it far less special. And you can dramatically lose your tension if you essentially use magic to overcome all your problems. Like every time the characters run into a situation, magic is the solution, and tension just drains straight out of your story at that point because your reader goes, oh, but they'll just solve it with magic. So this is something that you need to be aware of. In low magic, you do have your gritty realism. You do have your focus on characters coming through strongly without the distraction of magic. And you do have that complexity of conflict resolution, which is to say, it is harder for characters to solve their problems, and therefore that makes sometimes for a more engaging read. All of that being said, it does have its downsides as well. You have a much reduced spectacle sense, a much reduced fantastical sense. One of the conversations that I had with one of my beta readers early on, because I started out with less magic in play than I ended up in the end in my full world building. And one of the conversations that I had with my beta readers was he was like, but where's the fantasy? yes, this is a great world. The politics are amazing. The whole thing around the assassins is fantastic. I love the story, but I'm missing the actual fantastical part of the fantasy story. And you must bear this in mind. You are writing for an audience that wants fantasy, that wants that sense of escapism, that wants the spectacle. And if you go too far with your low magic system, you might lose a lot of those readers. The other thing that you need to bear in mind is that with a low magic system, because you lack things like healing, for example, you could end up in a situation where you need to kind of cotton wrap your characters, because if you let them get too hurt, it would take months for them to recover. And if you've played up this hard, low, gritty magic style, then and they just recover the next day from being half dead without magic, you're going to lose readers in terms of believability, because at that point they're going to say, okay, but you've just sold me on this world with no magic, and now you've hurt this character, but suddenly they're all fine again because you need them now. That doesn't work. No, that doesn't work at all. So it is worth bearing in mind that your gritty low magic system can result in some really dire complications in terms of healing. Okay, so what I really want to do in these high level choices that we're going to discuss is I want to contrast one world with another. So for high magic versus low magic, I'm going to contrast Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time with George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. Okay, so let's start with the definition of Robert Jordan's magic system. So in A Wheel of Time, high magic is definitely the order of the day. There are various magic systems, but obviously the one power and the true power is kind of the central tenet of Robert Jordan's world. And indeed, there's like the two halves of it, the male and the female, and that is the center of the conflict, is this the dragon reborn coming. It is a very structured magic system with very clear hierarchies, rules, even like ranks that people can attain. It has a definitive epic scope. It's a vast and intricately detailed world, and it is filled with fantastical creatures, with ancient artifacts, epic battles. It's got all the fantasy you could possibly wish for. By contrast, of course, that is not Martin's world. That is absolutely not Martin's world. In Martin's world, we have low magic. We have absolutely minimalist approach to magic, especially at the beginning. Once dragons re-enter the world, it starts becoming more magical again, and you start getting magic appearing again, which is great. But the start of it is very definitely low magic. However, it is very realistic and it is very gritty. People die in Martin's books with alarming regularity. Now, I think that has actually created somewhat of a problem for him in the later books, because he might need some of those people for an overcome, and I'm not sure how he's going to get them back, or if he is. But regardless, that's a different discussion. So you can see that these two worlds are very different, and yet they are both very popular. So let's talk about the strengths of the two. So in magic's role in the Wheel of Time is to be a driving force. It shapes the world, the characters, their destinies. But in A Song of Ice and Fire, magic is subtle and mysterious, and it takes a more backseat to the central role of the conflicting politics. People are so invested in their own power that they essentially will let the White Walkers come over the wall and create this dire situation. And this shows, whereas in Wheel of Time, it's very much the classic epic fantasy where people are striving to be, to overcome a villain. Both worlds are extremely rich, but they focus in different areas. Jordan focuses on, there's a lot of focus on magic and how it came to be here. Martin's world building focuses on political and social structure with different factions. In terms of character development, the Wheel of Time characters often go through epic journeys of self-discovery and growth, and magic plays a central role in that, either when they gain it or when they lose it. By contrast, in A Song of Ice and Fire, characters struggle with the morality of their choices in this very ambiguous world. So, for me, the choice between high and low magic comes down to, do you want magic to be almost a character in your world? Do you want characters to struggle with the nature of magic? Is using magic going to present them with certain moral conundrums? If you think of Jordan's world, you have the conundrum of men go crazy by using magic. This is potentially a cost of magic. Is it magic, the source of magic is corrupted? That kind of thing then becomes a central, almost a protagonist, almost a character, and it drives the morality of the discussion. By contrast, if you want to more play with those elements of people will fight each other to the exclusion of all else, if you want to focus on the political clash of people, then it's better to let magic take a backseat and to focus on having your lower fantasy elements while you focus on the clash of people interacting with each other. And one of the big reasons for that is because magic can fundamentally screw with your politics. A high magic system especially creates a situation where people hold so much personal power, like a mage can personally flatten this city. That makes it hard for politics to be discussed except by other mages, because they hold such enormous actual power, as opposed to holding the power of influence, which is what everybody holds in Martin's world. And that's why the Targaryens were such a devastating force in Martin's world. They held the personal power of the dragons. And that's why they created this situation where they just took over. Okay, so that is high magic versus low magic. Now let's talk about hidden magic versus open magic. So hidden magic is hidden as in the public at large doesn't know about magic for whatever reason. There's some kind of agreement around it between mages, or there's some kind of pact that was sealed, or there's some kind of masquerade in place. And an example of this is the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. And then open magic is the public does know. It is well known that magic exists and that people have it and fantastical creatures are there. And an example of this is Anita Blake by Laurel K. Hamilton, where vampires are seen as legal people. They have legal rights. The undead can walk around and, engage with people. And there's complicated issues like if you die and you come back as a vampire, who gets the inheritance and that kind of thing. So it's a very fun universe from that perspective. And I was really sad when she kind of fell off, like let that series trail into essentially just porn, because I really enjoyed it. Anyway, so with your contrast between these two and your advantages of these two is that with the Dresden Files, the fact that magic is secret gives you an extra line of tension. It gives you a line of tension when Harry is interacting with normals. It's like, okay, but what if this slips open? What if they know? What if they find out what he is? And they. Now, of course, Harry is pretty open about it, but at the same time, it's not like hugely public, right? And normals are normally kind of protected from it. And it's very much like, don't involve the world at large. So, for example, towards the later series, when things start getting bigger and bolder and there's all these effects that are really hard to hide, it starts becoming a question of what happens if the normal people find out about it. So it adds that extra element of tension. But I will say that I absolutely loved the way that Laurel K. Hamilton worked with vampires and the legal requirements in the Anita Blake universe. So how she set it up was, she said, okay, 2 years ago, there was a court case. And in this court case, a vampire took people to court and got the right to be counted as a living person in the United States. So they were now living people, or dead, undead people, but people with rights. But now you can't keep a vampire in a jail, so what do? So they had this job called vampire executioner, which is what our protagonist was, which is what Anita Blake was. So she's a vampire executioner and she hunts them, but she has to work with the police. She's not like an independent, she's not independent of them, at least at the beginning of the series. As the series goes on, that role changes as the United States government comes to terms with vampires and what they mean, and how you approach them as like citizens of the United States. And they ended up making the vampire executioners US Marshals, so as part of the US Marshal Service, and working with them in that aspect. And it was really well done from a world building perspective. It made me want to build an open urban fantasy world. And the thing is, if you do that, you lose that tension, obviously, of the secrecy versus the transparency. But you gain a lot of real world politics if you want to play with that. Now, that being said, that is also your downside. Because if you're writing like an urban fantasy, for example, and you say everyone knows about magic, boy, does that change a lot. Yeah, it changes so much if you think about it. You would have bureaucracy dealing with magic. You would have to have people who have to be registered for magic. It would be kind of like it would be a huge thing. If you think about Babylon 5 and like the Psi talents where they had Psi Core, so you're either a member of Psi Core or your magic is suppressed. So it would take things like that. You would have that level of bureaucracy, which is a lot of world building, right? Whereas if you go the secrecy route, like with Dresden Files, it's actually quite a simple world building. You just have to come up with a reason as to why it's kept secret. And Bob's your uncle, your world building's done, you can go forth and use your magic as long as people keep it a secret. I'm in two minds which way I really honestly prefer. I think personally that for my urban fantasy, I'll probably start secret and then move to an open world. Perhaps because I like the idea of an open world, but once you've gone open, that's it. You can't go back to secret, right? Open is open. So I feel like if you start secret, you can transition to open. But if you start open, you can't go back. But yeah, so that's open and secret and what they offer you. Then let's talk about that eternal, ongoing, everlasting debate of hard versus soft. Okay, so just to clarify so that everybody's on the same page, hard magic is your reader fully understands your magic system. Soft magic is your reader doesn't understand your magic system, but it is a scale, right? This is, you can go back and forth on this one. Okay, so I'm going to contrast Jacqueline Carey's magic system that she uses in the Nama trilogy with Brandon Sanderson's allomancy. Those are two pretty extremes on the scale. So Jacqueline Carey's Nama trilogy has a magic system that focuses on spirits and entities like that and gods and so on, where people have gifts that they kind of randomly are born with, and they can make deals with spirits and spiritual entities, or they can draw on the power of the spirit world. Like the protagonist can draw on the power of the wild places of the world. So it's a kind of like a druid influenced kind of idea. Now, it's not clearly defined, like how much power or when or so on, and she can use this to kind of grow plants or to hide herself, and that's like more or less it, sort of, maybe depending on the circumstances. Okay. The great thing about this is that magic continually feels like this mysterious thing, like this thing that everybody loves seeing. And when they interact with like the spirits and so on, you don't know what's going to happen. There's no clear like unlock value. Like everything is so dependent on what the characters do and say. And what this does is it allows you to play with um, the relationship that characters have with each other and that impact on their magic. Like love becomes this force between the characters that also guides their magic. Okay, so it's this very nebulous force, but at the same time it is usable and it drives character growth. So if we now look at allomancy, this is probably one of the best hard magic systems out there. Pretty much you consume a metal, you burn that metal, and then you can use it to have a certain effect. Okay, it is consistent and it's predictable and it's a tool. And as such, when Sanderson uses it, we as the reader, we know what's going to happen. And so it becomes part of the character's ability to solve problems. And we can speculate on how they're going to use their magic. It also allows you to add all of that depth to world building. Like, for example, there's those spikes in the city in Mistborn that you only later realize those spikes are there to allow an allomancer to fly. So that kind of world building comes from this kind of hard magic system. And that is also your contrast between the two. Your softer magic does allow for more flexibility and it does give you more narrative focus. But by contrast, your hard magic system allows readers to speculate on what's going to happen. How is magic going to be used to solve this problem? And that can be very interesting from a reader perspective. Maya says in the chat that yes, low magic is rather boring. It can be. It can be. Um, and I have a question over here. Ronald Watson says, do you think hidden magic is more common in urban fantasy or often limited to witches and cults? Yeah, so it is most often that hidden magic is more common in your urban fantasy worlds. It is rare to have hidden fantasy in your um, fully secondary world. And for those of you who don't know, fully secondary world means it's not Earth, right? And while it's uncommon to have hidden magic in fully secondary worlds, it's not unheard of. I have seen it done and have it been like it's a secret or so on. But it is much more common in your urban fantasy. And hello, Julio. It is a pleasure to see you at the live stream. Um, Alrighty. So let's talk about. I don't see any other major questions in the chat. So I'm going to move on to genetic versus non-genetic magic systems. So for those of you who, Benjamin Montoya asked in the chat, any suggestion for something akin to alchemical magic that one could refer to? I actually did a video on alchemical magic. So if you're interested in alchemical magic, you can check that out in the videos on my channel. I think I just called it Alchemy or Alchemy in Fantasy, something like that. So yeah, and yeah, smoke dementia is correct. Hidden magic does make it easier in urban fantasy. Okay, so genetic versus non-genetic. So what I mean by this is in genetic, magic is inherited. So your parents are mages, you're a mage. Non-genetic magic comes from some other reason. Okay, so for this, I'm actually going to contrast two Brandon Sanderson worlds. Allomancy, the world of Mistborn, is a genetic magic system. Okay, it's an inherited ability. So people are born with the innate ability to use specific allomantic powers. And this has resulted in distinct bloodlines of nobility, and it limits the accessibility of the magic. By contrast, in the Stormlight Archive, Sanderson went with a non-genetic magic system. So magic comes from binding with the surge spirits. And these were the sprites. And these creatures, or these entities, then give the mage their power. Now, the interesting thing with surge binding and with the sprites that you bind with is that you actually only can bind with certain sprites that give you magic if you've encountered emotional trauma. So that is a very interesting magic system to explore from that perspective. So if you've been hurt, that somehow opens you up to bind with these sprites and actually start using magic. Now, there have been a couple of people in the chat already who have made statements which are true about genetic magic. It does reduce the characters of your world. So it reduces the number of people who can use magic. And yeah, it can sound like aristocratic propaganda. Essentially, you're saying the aristocrats are in charge because they have magic, and they have magic because they look after their bloodlines. Like it's a whole self-perpetuating, these people are in charge and they're in charge because they're actually better kind of magocracy idea. Now, that is true, okay? But genetic magic systems do also allow you to explore some things if you make it wide enough. Because here's the big thing with genetic magic systems. If it is actually genetic, natural selection would have ensured that most people have magic. So if you want to go with a genetic magic system, an actual genetic magic system, then the vast majority of people in your world should have access to magic. And then it's a case of being an athlete or being a scholar or whatever. You might have certain innate natural talents, but you also have to work at it. You have to train at it. So it depends, you know. So yes, I agree that genetic magic can result in a poor implementation, but it can also contribute to making a worldwide magic system. Now, your non-genetic allows you to be much more interesting with why people then have access to magic. You know, is it through emotional trauma? Is it because they got bitten by a radioactive spider? Is, you know, so your origin story of a mage then can change quite a bit. There's a question in the chat. Usually magic studying at magic school seems very easy. Say a few words, flick your wand. In real life, schools are hard. So, Niraj, so I'll tell you what the problem is. While studying magic is really hard, or while studying is really hard and really complicated, nobody wants to read about spending 20 hours a week sitting in front of a set of books, you know, drumming facts into your head. And I guess that's the big problem, is you have to somehow compress that magic down to, you know, to that studying time down to something that is reasonable for the reader to consume. So yeah. Now, for example, so I want to say something about genetic magic systems and what you do with them. For example, look in my books, it looks like my magic system is genetic until the third book, the one that's out now, when you realize, or the reader realizes, that it's not actually genetic, or at least it's not genetic in the way that they thought it was. And so you can make that kind of play where you have something appear as one thing and then look like something else. But you do run the risk of, we've seen in the crowd, like people saying, you know, they don't like genetic magic systems. And there are more people now that don't like genetic magic systems than those that do. So bear that in mind with your genetic magic systems. I took a calculated risk with my books and said, okay, I'm going to look like a genetic magic system, with a coming reveal in later books as to what actually happened in the world to set this up. Then in terms of non-genetic and in terms of how to explore studies, right? Yeah, Ronald Watson makes the point of magic schools in books focus on the drama outside the classrooms. Absolutely. Because inside the classroom, it can be really, really boring. You know, you basically just, it's like studying mathematics. You're sitting with a whole bunch of formulas and so on. Like, I studied mathematics at university, and it was essentially sitting there in front of my books, studying formulas, studying the basic axioms, studying theorems, understanding how it fits together, and then doing example after example of problem solving in the exercises in the book. Now, the net end result is that I can use vector arithmetic in computer science to, you know, render things on the screen and to do graph visualizations in my day job and stuff like that. It looks really cool. But the 3 years that I spent in university getting that skill is pretty boring. So yeah, the problem with magic schools is the same as the problem with any schools. Yeah, and in terms of my world's magical beasts that give people powers, yes, absolutely, somebody outside the family can absolutely survive the trial. but the families control access to those magical beasts, and hence they are the ones who sent their kids down there, and they're the ones who learn that form of magic. And the other form of magic, hobby, the people of the one continent gave that up in order to imprison Asapidmala. Anyway, so that's my lore of Sangwheel Chronicles. Yeah, you could absolutely try with a magic school to have researching and experimentation and then have things go wrong. The only problem with that is if you repeatedly have experiments and research and things go right and things go wrong, it starts to feel to your reader like that is the whole of your story, is this double dipping into research, things go wrong, things get set right. So it's something you can do kind of once, but you can't do repeatedly book after book. So yeah, it it's the same with any school story, really, and with any school system. It's boring to read about people just studying. So you have to kind of spice it up in some way. So those are my big choices that I wanted to talk about. Of course, there's also immediacy versus non-immediacy, but I did do a video on that recently, and that video covered basically everything that I wanted to say there, which is you can either have the magic system be I cast a spell, things happen, or you can have it be like I create things which then hold the potential for magic, which is released at a later time with a trigger. And you can kind of scale that in between those two extremes. So I think I discussed that quite extensively in that video if you're interested in that big choice. So those are my four big choices. So you have high magic versus low magic, hidden magic versus open, hard versus soft, and then genetic versus non-genetic. And I think the one that you need to put the most thought into is genetic versus non-genetic, because it's way too easy to just go and fall into genetic magic systems and then not think through the implications of what you're saying. I mean, it is there. You are essentially saying with a genetic magic system that one set of bloodlines has access to superpower. Why? Like, why haven't they completely dominated the world? Why doesn't everybody have access to superpower unless something has recently changed and it is now something that this family has access to? Because in your um, in your in your evolutionary process, if magic is such a thing, it would have been a gene to be selected for. So yeah, um, I don't say don't go genetic, not by any stretch of the imagination, but go genetic with choice. Think through, like with everything in world building, think through what baggage that world building brings with it. Like, if you introduce slavery into your world, think of the baggage that slavery brings with it. Think of how readers will experience reading about it and exercise caution and understanding. If you're going to introduce genetic magic systems, think about what you are saying. Consider the theme that you are espousing, and then work within those limitations. Like, there's a good example from Camille in the chat that says if you have genetic powers, there could be like a blood contract that some ancestor made, and that is now carried in your bloodline forward through this contract made with dark powers. Then you can explore concepts like sins of the father. Is it right and just that sins of the father carry through? Should you be able to give up your inheritance? That kind of thing. So you've got to think about what you choosing to bring into your world by making certain world building choices. And it's worth thinking about the baggage that comes with a concept. And yeah, do not attribute your genetic magic to something like midichlorians, please. Please. um, Quinton, it is an absolute pleasure to have helped you with your world building. And if you're interested in working with me directly on my world building, you can check out my Ko-fi page where you can purchase my world building services. Okay, I think that is quite enough from me. I have talked myself dry on this one. So I hope that you all have enjoyed it. And actually, no, sorry, Nagalim's made a statement in chat that I do want to talk on. She said, or they said that there is a situation with the Naan in Babylon 5 where they have the genetic potential for psi powers, but they actually decimated people with psi powers, and now it's non-existent because, those people didn't get to breed and pass on the gene. So the reason why I bring that up is because I am busy working on a science fantasy series of world building books that is of world building videos that will start dropping in a few weeks. So for those of you who enjoyed that series, it is one of the primary series that I am drawing on in terms of my notebooks. And anyway, I hope that everybody has an amazing weekend. What is your Saturday and your Sunday, and that you enjoyed the stream. And I will see you soon.